This sacred and atmospheric site was once the scene of a puzzling death, a medieval mystery. 700 years ago, a man was buried in a deep pit, wedged between the earth and a huge rock. Was this an accident, murder, or a tragic case of being in the wrong place at the wrong time? Who was the man beneath the megalith?
What was this man doing in the community, and why did he die?
He's been rather tossed into the grave. Nobody cares. I think he's someone from outside the immediate community, someone who had no status.
We've never been able to really get to the roots of what actually happened to this man. We now have the opportunity to reopen this medieval case.
Archaeologist Mike Pitts has been fascinated by this story for years. He is determined to get to the bottom of who this man was and how he died. The case of a man apparently crushed to death beneath a Stone Age megalith has been a puzzle for archaeologist Mike Pitts, as the circumstances surrounding the death have never been fully explained.
I first came to Avebury when I was still at school, and like many people who come here, it made a huge impression on me. And one of many stories I took with me was of the barber surgeon, a medieval man who had been killed when a megalith fell on him, and both the man and the stone were buried in the pit together.
Although Mike has been aware of this story for many years, having lived and worked in Avebury, he has held doubts about its authenticity. Now he's uncovered new forensic evidence, which he hopes will help solve the mystery and finally explain what really happened. The prehistoric site of Avebury nestles in the rolling hills of England's West Country. The megaliths are made from local sandstone. They are one of the UK's greatest archaeological attractions and are visited by people from all over the world. Although the stone circle was built before 2000 BCE, the ancestors of the people who constructed it had already been farming in the area for at least 1,000 years. These first communities thrived by grazing their animals on its lush pastures. Not only did the area provide its communities with food, but it was also a religious site dedicated to elaborate rituals, celebrations of birth, life, and death. Its famous standing stone circle, containing about 100 megaliths, is one of the largest in Europe. These sacred ancient monuments still retain a powerful air of mystery. This impressive stone harbors a dreadful secret: the mysterious death of a man found pinned beneath its 13-ton weight. How did he end up here? What happened? The body was first discovered in 1938 by archaeologist Alexander Keeler. His team were in the process of uncovering stones which had been mysteriously toppled over and buried sometime in the Middle Ages. However, while attempting to lift one of these stones, they found more than they'd bargained for.
There's a 13-ton megalith lying on its side, and at the edge of the pit, underneath the stone, the complete body of a man. And the stone is so close to the edge of the pit that there's no chance that the body was slipped down under the stone. So on the face of it, it looks as if the stone must have fallen on him and presumably killed him.
However, for Mike, this story raises more questions than it answers.
What was this man doing helping push over megaliths in the Middle Ages? And why did he die? What was he doing in the community? Well, one of the great pieces of information we have to help us here is that on his remains were found a few objects that give us some clues as to the profession that perhaps he was practicing. And those are here in the museum in Avebury.
The objects found with the body are remarkably well preserved. They include 3 coins, a small iron probe, a belt buckle, and a pair of scissors. They suggest that this man was a barber surgeon, a medieval professional who traveled from town to town using his collection of tools and instruments to provide services, ranging from hair cutting to bloodletting, or in more serious cases, even amputation. Since the body, complete with its tools, was discovered in the 1930s, it has been known as the barber surgeon. The mystery remains. How or why did this ordinary tradesman end up buried beneath a pagan standing stone? Could his death help us to understand life in medieval England? The Alexander Keeler Museum at Avebury is the first stop for Mike in his bid to find the truth behind the myth. For an investigative archaeologist, the barber surgeon's possessions found at the burial site are crucial primary evidence. Mike enlists the help of historian Dr. Paul Robinson, who will help him create a clearer picture of the life and times of the barber surgeon.
In the 1320s.
The coins found with the body are the largest clue to indicate the date of this strange death. 3 silver coins, 2 pennies minted around 1310, and a French copy of an English coin in circulation in England around 1320, tell us that this man lived in the late medieval period.
So would these coins have been valuable? Was he a rich man?
No, not at all. I think it's his working purse full of money.
Right.
It's not a great deal of money at all. And to judge from the belt buckle, which is made of iron, not brass or gilded bronze or something like that, he's a working class man, an ordinary person.
But then the other objects look to me rather special. I mean, there's a pair of scissors here and something old there. Do they tell us something about what he might have been doing?
Well, the scissors are very exciting. They're very, very rare at this early date. Scissors are a craftsman's tools. They are for cutting precisely, which you can't do with shears. And the sort of person that would have used scissors is a barber, of course, a tailor, a glover, a hatter, someone who's got to cut neatly and precisely. But then you come to the other object, which is very odd. And although it's been described as a surgeon's probe, I don't think it is. I'd see it as a bodkin, as used by someone working in fabrics or possibly in leather.
A bodkin is a thick needle used for piercing holes in leather or textiles.
So a bodkin of some type and a pair of scissors, then he's somebody working with leather or with fabrics, a tailor?
Yes, I think a tailor is a very reasonable suggestion,
Right.
and the scissors used to cut thread.
And you were saying the scissors are quite rare, so is this something you might expect to find on the possession of somebody in a small village like Avebury?
Not every day of the year, but of course there would be itinerants that came through, and if you had a fair or a festival, you might find that tailors or shoemakers would come from the nearest town. They take orders and then go away and make them up and then return later.
Right.
So there's no reason for seeing him as an Avebury person.
In medieval times, most of Avebury's inhabitants were agricultural workers. Women laboured alongside men in the fields. Nursing, spinning and weaving were also women's work. Others worked in trades directly related to farming: blacksmiths, millers, thatchers. So it appears that the barber surgeon came from outside Avebury. He was more likely a tailor, travelling a regular route from one community to another, equipped with the tools of his trade. Although Mike is now nearer the truth about who this man was, the big question that remains is exactly what happened to him. Was he really crushed beneath a 13-ton sacred megalith? For decades, we have been unable to study the barber surgeon's skeleton due to an extraordinary twist of fate after its initial discovery. After the excavation of 1938, the barber surgeon's remains were sent to the Royal College of Surgeons in London. But the college was bombed during the Second World War, and it was assumed that the barber surgeon's skeleton had been destroyed forever. So the details of his death remained a mystery.
Then only a couple of years ago, I discovered that the skeleton had actually survived this bombing raid and was in the basement of another London museum. So now, after all these years, we have the opportunity, perhaps, to understand exactly what happened to this man those centuries ago in the 14th century.
The barber surgeon's remains are now housed in a Natural History Museum. 6 decades since they were thought lost forever, they are once again available for inspection. There is one question in particular that Mike hopes they will provide an answer to.
These megaliths are also different from each other. They have their own personalities, but somehow I feel if even a stone half the size of this one were to fall on me, there would be very little doubt as to the outcome. Now we know we have the skeleton, we can lay it out and examine the bones. If a stone like this were to fall on him, one imagines the bones would be very badly damaged, and we have the opportunity to go to the Natural History Museum to find out exactly what did happen.
The awe-inspiring setting of the Natural History Museum in London was Mike's next port of call. It's famous for its spectacular dinosaurs, but it's the paleontology department that is home to the museum's human remains collection.
Hello, Mike. Hi.
It was here that the barber surgeon's skeleton was taken after its previous home, the Royal College of Surgeons, was directly hit in a bombing raid in the Second World War. Here it lay, unobserved for nearly 60 years, until during a chance inspection of the museum records, Mike realized that the skeleton had survived and could once again be studied. Forensic analysis of the bones will help Mike find out more about this case. Was the barber surgeon crushed to death? Or was he pinned down, unable to escape, left to die a slow and painful death? Perhaps he was already dead and simply laid in the pit before the stone fell.
This is an extraordinary moment because this man has such a remarkable history. And for most of my professional career, along with all my colleagues, I'd imagine that his bones had been destroyed over half a century ago. And yet here he is, extraordinarily well preserved, I think. My reaction looking at this skeleton is largely, I think, emotional. So we have Anthea Boylston, who is a scientist who spent a great deal of her time looking at human remains and for a more forensic analysis of these bones.
Mike has invited osteoarchaeologist Anthea Boylston to the Natural History Museum for the forensic analysis of the bones.
So that suggests he wasn't a very robust individual. See, it's quite gracile, hasn't got marked muscle attachments.
Anthea's measurements and observations tell Mike that this medieval barber surgeon, or tailor, was a slight man, not used to heavy labour, who died in his late 20s.
The wear is not very heavy, and that suggests an individual between 25 and 30.
Would Anthea agree with the original archaeologist's report, which professed that the man had been crushed to death, suffering multiple fractures?
For over half a century, tour guides in Avebury have been telling people how this man was crushed to death by a megalith, and I think we'd both agree, looking at the bones now, it doesn't really look as if a 15-ton stone has fallen on this man. What do you make of the fractures there are here?
Well, if I look at the edges of the bones, I want to know if they were broken before death, at the time of death, or after death occurred. So I'm looking at the type of break it is and the colour of the broken bone. And most of the breaks are definitely something that's happened long after death has occurred. But there is this one break which is a bit more suspicious, which is this part of the left pelvis. You can see that that edge is stained by the soil.
Yes, it's quite brown, isn't it?
It's quite brown and it's quite straight, and there's flaking of the back of the bone, which might suggest that it was something that had happened around the time of death. But that could be after death as well as before.
Right. So what you're saying is that this brown colour on the break surface suggests that it had been lying in the ground, broken for a very long time, and like the rib you had earlier had quite a white, clean break, and that's the difference.
That's right.
Right. And this bit of bone comes from the hip?
Yes, this comes from the hip bone on the left side.
Okay, so just this bit's been broken off the top. That's interesting because that's a break, but it's still not massively traumatic. I mean, it's hardly something that perhaps a 15-ton megalith is going to do if it falls on me. Somehow I'd expect it to completely squash me.
No, I can't see severe evidence of crushing of the rib cage or the kinds of things that you might expect if a megalith had fallen on you.
Anthea concludes that although it is impossible to discover the exact cause of death, one that can certainly be ruled out is extreme trauma to the skeleton, such as being crushed. The only significant break that happened around the time of death was to the hip bone. Would this provide a clue to the man's fate? There is also a wound on the skull, which may give Anthea a fresh lead. It's quite severe, a strange injury to have been suffered by a tailor. What could it signify? Was he injured before he died, or was this wound inflicted at the time of death? Can this new finding and Anthea's expertise help Mike begin to piece together the answers to this latest puzzle? Anthea now turns her attention to the head injury.
You can see that there's a kind of folded area, which is linear in direction, and there's actually another one coming towards it from this angle. And the fact that the edges fold in tells me that it's a healed wound. It's not something that occurred around the time of death. But the fact that it's linear suggests that it's a blade injury that has healed well before this person died.
So would that be a sword?
Most likely a sword. Occasionally you get cutting injuries from daggers, but that's less likely in this case.
So, did the barber surgeon sustain the wounds to his head in a duel, a brawl, or was he involved in battle?
Do you think the most likely context for this would be a battlefield?
I don't think it suggests a battlefield because it's only 2 injuries, and often in a battlefield situation you can get injuries all around the head, and they tend to be rather more ferocious.
So if not a battle, how do you think this might have happened?
Well, I think it's a kind of one-off event, probably.
Perhaps almost a duel with another man?
Almost a duel, something like that.
This intimate face-to-face encounter with a man who died 700 years ago has provided Mike with valuable new information.
Now I know a lot more about this man than I did before I came up to look at his bones. I confirmed that he's male. I know how old he was. He died quite young, in his 20s. He's got a couple of sword wounds on his head, but they're well healed up and apparently probably not acquired in battle. And there's a mysterious fracture on his hip, but nothing to suggest that something as large as a megalith has fallen on him to kill him. And so there are a number of really quite big questions I now have in my mind that are different from the ones I had before I came up here.
Mike decides to take this fresh forensic evidence back to the scene of the death to see if it can help him figure out more. The new question that's emerged is, if the barber surgeon was already dead when he was put in the pit with the stone, then why was he buried in such a strange place? Could it have been a religious ritual? Why was he not buried in the village churchyard, which would have been customary at the time? Mike once again seeks the advice of historian Paul Robinson to see what he makes of the new evidence.
I would imagine somehow he ought to have been in this graveyard rather than out there in the stone circle. So why do you think he might have been not buried in the churchyard?
Well, you shouldn't assume that automatically that everyone will be buried in the churchyard. In fact, there's a statute from the Diocese of Salisbury of about 1215 which specifies people who needn't be buried in the churchyard,
right.
And they include, if I remember correctly, manifest usurers.
So what's that? There's people who lend money.
Money lenders, yes. Excommunicants, and finally strangers to the parish, which is possibly more relevant with us today.
Well, that's interesting, because earlier you were talking about the possibility this man might have been a tailor and somebody who didn't live in the parish. So that would fit.
Yes, and in fact, I think the way that he's been rather tossed into the grave, where he's buried, he's not buried devoutly in any way. He's just placed willy-nilly in a burial. So
what makes you think he was thrown in rather than laid carefully?
Well, he's face down, his left knee is touching his hand.
Right.
He's just not been
Right,
placed
so he's
carefully.
not laid out carefully.
Nobody cares how he's been
Right.
buried. There's no friends, no family have been involved.
The fact that he was buried here and not in a village just down the road suggests that also he had no relatives nearby who might have taken him home, so perhaps he was a real stranger to the district.
Yes, I think he's someone who the local people would have regarded, in fact, as a foreigner, someone from outside the immediate community, someone with no links at all, and someone who had no status and no ties at all with the parish.
So he's buried outside the churchyard, and apparently in this pit that is open, ready to take him, but not obviously dug for him because it's got this huge megalith in it. So it raises the bigger question of why the stone itself was being buried.
Well, there seem to be two main reasons. One, that they see the stones as a symbol of paganism of some sort, or secondly, that they're just in the way of agriculture and they want to bury them so they can get on with their farming. But whether those are the real answers, we just don't know at all.
And do we have no written record of this?
Absolutely nothing at all.
If the barber surgeon was indeed an unattached drifter, plying his trade from one district to another, could this have any bearing on the sword wounds to his head, which Anthea Boylston believed were caused by a duel or a fight?
So the man had a couple of sword wounds on his head. What do you make of those?
Well, my inclination is to think that he suffered them in a battle, because the skeletons excavated at London show that people who'd been in urban brawls are knifed. They're not hit with a sword.
So Anthea thought that the wounds were too small to be from battle, that where she's seen people who've been wounded in battle, they have their heads covered in wounds.
I suspect that's for people who died. You know,
Right.
they've been hacked to pieces on the ground. But I think this is a man who's possibly been lucky. He's been lightly wounded and managed to get away.
But the evidence of his bones show us that he was a very slightly built man. Could he have been a soldier?
Yes, I wouldn't see any problem there at all. I mean, I'd see him as a conscript, where the manor or the village has been told to supply a certain quota of people, and they wouldn't necessarily send their better people, that they'd send perhaps an orphan, an undernourished person, someone they could perhaps afford to lose.
So the barber surgeon or tailor could have died in Avebury, but as a stranger to the villagers. His final resting place was most likely a makeshift grave, a hole in the ground that had already been dug for another purpose, the burial of the megalith. Over the last 1,000 years, many of the original 600 standing stones were displaced, leaving only about 100. Some were broken up for building materials, others, like the barber's stone, were buried during anti-pagan campaigns fostered by the medieval church. The standing stones were potent symbols of pre-Christian paganism. Perhaps a local church ordered their burial. It would have been a job requiring maximum effort. The community would have had to have teamed together to dig huge pits in the ground, then push over rocks into the ground, out of sight. It seems it was one of these pits that provided a convenient burial place for a stranger who died in the village. But there is still one thing that doesn't fit. Mike cannot understand how the barber surgeon could have been buried beneath the megalith unless it fell or was pushed on him afterwards. But this would have caused far greater damage to the skeleton than was actually found. By returning to the original archaeological documents and dig diary from 1938, Mike is now able to form a theory. It is based on Anthea's discovery of the broken hip bone, an injury we know happened just before or after death.
Back here in Avebury, looking at the excavation records, I was able to piece the story together, and the fracture on his hip is at the precise point, very clearly described in the excavation diary, where the megalith had pinned his bone to the edge of the chalk pit. And we can see now, looking at the records, that what appears to have happened is the stone was pushed into the pit, and there was a gap beside the megalith, and this man who had already died was just thrown into the pit, apparently no ceremony at all. And then perhaps as the pit was being backfilled, the stone slipped just a little bit and closed that gap and pinned his hip and broke the bone against the edge of the pit.
So at last, the legend of the barber surgeon killed by a fallen megalith appears to have been disproved. But for Mike Pitts, this mysterious medieval man is no less intriguing for that.
I feel I've been on a journey with this man for more than half my life. Along with everybody else, I believed that he died when a megalith fell on him. Now, looking at the skeleton, it was obvious he hadn't been killed by the megalith. So we began with a legend, and I feel now that I have the story of a real man, an itinerant tailor, perhaps somebody who'd fought in battle early in his life, who died, we don't know how, but ended up ignominiously thrown into this pit with a megalith. Perhaps centuries later we can grant this man a respect that he certainly wasn't shown at the moment of his death.
The mysterious case of a skeleton found buried in a medieval cemetery smacks of a vicious and violent murder. The body was found in the quaint town of Lewes, which lies nestled in the peaceful rolling downs of southern England. Who was this person? known to archaeologists as skeleton 180. How did he or she die, and why?
It certainly would have been a violent death and very unpleasant.
I think 180 died a messy, bloody and literally traumatic death.
Skeleton 180 had obviously been hit with some sharp implement which had caused the damage to the head.
It makes you wonder, why hadn't he stood up and defended himself? What had happened to him?
Archaeologist Lucy Seiburn, who works in a village near Lewis, is on the case. She wants to find out what happened to 180 the day he died. Lucy Seiburn was present at the excavation of the site where 180 was found. The team found over 100 bodies dating from medieval times, but it was a skeleton given the archive number 180 that captured Lucy's imagination. It was found in the grounds of this modern community care centre on the site of what was an ancient hospital known as the House of Lepers. This 18th century watercolour by Lewis artist James Lambert shows the hospital 5 centuries later. It is useful evidence which conveys the simple and rural life of Lewis even then. At the time of the death of 180, the settlement was even more rustic and isolated.
When we came across 180, it was clear that there was something else going on. There were cuts and damage to the skull that didn't appear to be a result of after-death activity, but perhaps may have caused the death. This is unusual and makes the skeleton far more interesting because we can perhaps learn a lot more about the death of the individual and perhaps the life of the individual.
But it was the burial location of the skeleton which was particularly mysterious.
Roughly here is where skeleton 180 came from, and what makes it particularly interesting is the apparent violent death that he seems to have suffered. It was immediately apparent that there were several cuts to the head, and it's quite possible that one of them killed him instantly.
If 180 died instantly from one of the head wounds with no hope of survival, this provides Lucy with a mystery. A medieval hospital such as the House of Lepers was a religious institution, a hospice for the chronically ill. A person with injuries such as those suffered by 180 would not have been brought here for medical treatment. Why did he end up in the hospital cemetery and not in a church cemetery?
It's possible that he was attacked or ambushed. It might have been a robbery that went wrong. It could also have been a domestic murder. The other alternative is a battle.
Lewis is a historic town. Nestled in the heart of the Sussex countryside, it thrived during the Middle Ages as a prime trading post. Its strong castle was built shortly after the Norman conquest of 1066. The royalist family de Warenne occupied the imposing fortress during the 13th century, around the time 180 was alive. It remains a symbol of the famous Battle of Lewes of 1264, commemorated in the Song of Lewes. The English army rode the heavy storm of mighty war at Lewes Castle walls. They battle joined the 14th of May, and dreadful was the strife in Sussex county. Hundreds fell, for mighty was the sword. It was on the outskirts of the town that a team of archaeologists unearthed this ancient mystery, the fate of skeleton 180, and were allowed a fascinating glimpse into a key moment of England's history. By studying the remains on the hospital site, the team was hoping to learn more about medieval disease and illness, but when they came across skeleton 180, the alarm bell started to ring. This person had certainly not suffered the kind of death typical of a medieval hospital. This was a mystery to the archaeologists. Lucy Seiburn was particularly intrigued by this site because of the location of skeleton 180.
The question must be asked, why was he in the hospital cemetery, which surely is normally reserved for inmates of the hospital? We were dealing with the cemetery of a medieval hospital, so we were expecting to find diseases that may have killed the individuals. And when you first dig up the skeletons, you're looking for that sort of information on the bones.
Forensic examination of the skeletons found in the cemetery reveals the diseases or trauma suffered by each individual, but it's difficult to tell the exact cause of death.
There were some individuals that had the onset of infectious diseases and traumatic injuries, which may have killed them. There were a couple of individuals who died from leprosy, but in most cases it's impossible to tell. Skeleton 180 had obviously been hit with some sharp implement. The reason for this remains uncertain at the moment.
180's burial in a 13th century cemetery could be a vital lead for Lucy. Perhaps 180's death coincides with the Battle of Lewes, fought outside the town in 1264. Could 180 have been a soldier, perhaps even a knight, cut down in this battle? Forensic science will give Lucy a clearer picture of what 180 was like and may help her figure out how he died. Lucy has sent the remains to osteoarchaeologist Sue Brown. Closer analysis may help her solve the mystery of 180.
180 appeared to have suffered a very unpleasant death in that there were a lot of unhealed cuts all over the back of his head, and it makes you wonder how on earth he had been in such a position that he'd been able to receive all these cuts. Why hadn't he stood up and defended himself? What had happened to him? It looks as though the cuts have come from different angles. Was he face down on the ground, being slashed at from above? Was he standing up and ambushed from behind? Was it a murder? Was he in a battle? But if he was in a battle, was he wearing a helmet? Maybe he was brought down and then hacked about when he was on the ground after his helmet had come off. So it's all very intriguing.
At the end of the day's work, Lucy arrives at Sue's laboratory in England's New Forest. Before she speculates on the cause of death, Sue will be able to confirm 180's sex, age, and stature.
It is a male. The cranium has got quite well-developed brow ridges, a sloping forehead. The nuchal crest is quite well-developed. All these are typical characters of maleness. And the femur is quite long, expanded distally, and reasonably large femur head. But actually, it's not a very muscular skeleton for a male. You'll probably notice there's not much development of muscle attachments on the upper arm, is there?
No, there isn't.
Where the deltoid muscles are attached.
The upper arms of a professional soldier would have been more muscular than average because of the weight of armour and weapons, between 40 pounds for the average militiaman and 75 pounds for a knight. The bone would show robust prominence where the muscle was attached, but 180's bones display none of these signs.
Yeah. And I measured the femur to estimate his height, and he is 5'7" high about, which is not particularly tall for a man. It's about average for the males from this cemetery.
What about the age?
From the wear on the teeth, I think he is between 35 and 45 years old.
Yes, it's quite worn in places.
180's skeleton suggests that he wasn't a professional soldier. Perhaps, then, he was just caught in the crossfire.
One of the other things we noticed straight away was the cuts to the head. You've obviously had a chance to have a good look at those now.
Yes, they are very dramatic, aren't they? All the cuts are concentrated on the head. Probably 7 or possibly more cuts on his head.
Yes, yeah, incredible.
We've got quite a long one which extends from more or less the centre of the back of the head over towards the ear, the right ear. It finishes about there. Yeah. And that was a deep one. That went through the inner table of bone into the brain. And then there's one up here on the top of the head. It's a big cut which goes right round there. There's the cut edge. And it's removed this sliver of bone, which was actually recovered during excavation.
They're really quite dramatic cuts,
yes,
aren't they?
Yes, they are. There are 2 more cuts here in the region of the right ear. One of them has gone through and sliced the lower jaw. So he was hit on the side of the head as well as on top.
And obviously it's a very violent attack. Have you got any idea what might have caused it?
I think probably if something thicker like a battle axe had been used, there'd be more crushing of the bone at the edges and little cracks, little fractures radiating away from the ends of the cuts, and you've got nothing like that happening at all here. So I think the blade was quite slender, perhaps a sword. And it's obviously somebody using a considerable amount of force to make all these deep cuts into his head.
And obviously one possibility is that he's a battle victim.
That's a possibility. that he was slashed at from the side and he fell onto the ground face down. And then the assailant stood over him and delivered a lot of blows. They're from all different angles. So whether he was struggling to get up while he was on the ground, or whether the assailant was moving around, one doesn't know.
It must have been a very unpleasant attack, whatever the case. Another possibility is that it was an ambush of some sort.
Yes, with no head covering at all. Yes. Exactly. Yes. Surprised him, brought him down, and possibly more than one person attacking him. Who knows?
Even after their discussion, Lucy still isn't convinced that 180 was a battle victim. Sue's analysis has proved that 180 can't have been a young, strong knight. He was middle-aged and far from muscular enough to wield the weapons carried by a soldier. Also, he wasn't buried in the mass graves found on the battlefield itself, but in a hospital cemetery more than a mile away. What has been confirmed is that his injuries were caused by a sharp blade. The question of what weapon might have been used to inflict these injuries is the next task for Lucy. Knowing this will help determine who he was and how he died. Medieval expert Nick Marshall has come to Lewis to experiment with the array of weapons that might have killed 180. Could it have been a sword, dagger, battle axe, agricultural tool? What was it that was used to end 180's days? Nick will have to see for himself the injuries sustained by 180 to begin to make his assessment. Lucy talks him through the cuts and their severity.
So there's quite a range, real sort of severe attack.
Yeah, it's the sort of thing you'd expect under the battlefield conditions. And I'd say certainly struck by more than one person from behind, maybe either on horseback because they're from above and behind. So if someone's sort of going past and doing that sort of move, or he's been struck by somebody stunned and fallen to his knees, and then everybody around has just laid into him as he's been going down.
It's sort of a frenzied attack, isn't it, really?
Yeah. Looking at that, that looks as if it's done mainly by edged weapons.
Yeah, it's got to be a sharp edge.
So if it was someone on horseback with something like that,
right,
which is the typical sword of the period, there is a fair weight behind it, and then the advantage is if you want to put extra weight in it, you can use it double-handed. Certainly that would be capable of taking off lumps of the skull, as in the wounds there. And also this sort of injury here, where it looks like it's run across the top. If you don't quite make the blow, it would just run across and skim down. That's one possibility. Some of them don't look quite deep enough, though. That sort of thing there, with the chip out, could be a glancing blow from an axe like that, which is more of a peasant weapon. If that comes in at the side, it will take a chip out like that, just as it would out of a log.
It's clear that the injuries to 180 were made by a sharp implement. But which weapons definitely did not cause his death?
A few of the foot soldiers may have been carrying something like this, vicious-looking implement. Now, I could quite easily say that wasn't done by this, because this weapon, if it hits you on the head like that, would tend to cut the skull completely in half and go through the top of your body as well.
I think we can safely say it wasn't one of those.
Yeah.
It's got to be something with a lot of force, hasn't it?
That's right, yeah. That's why I would put my bet on a sword or an axe for that.
Sword or an axe.
Or a bit of both.
Considering most soldiers wore head protection, is there any explanation of 180's head injuries?
I say, by the law, most of them should have head protection. The lowliest peasant would wear a pot helm like this, which is fairly simple iron bowl, but that would protect the top of the skull quite well. But when you actually have it on, it really doesn't give much protection to the back of the head. So if he'd been struck on the head wearing this and then gone forwards, he could have been struck on the back of the head and lost it.
So I suppose he could have been knocked down and perhaps the helmet came off, which then would have allowed all these other injuries.
When you get in a melee, what you'd end up with is small groups from each side all mixed up through the battle line. And once he's stunned or something, everybody will notice that he's weak and will all try and take him out. So if he goes down, that's it. You make sure he's out and move on to the next one.
Nick's expertise makes Lucy more convinced that 180 was actually a battle victim and not the victim of murder. Her next task will be to try to explain the mystery of his burial location, far away from the battlefield.
The one thing we are sure about is that the violent cuts to the head caused the death of this individual. We now need to work out in what sort of circumstance these cuts might have been inflicted. Sue was able to tell us that it was probably a very thin blade that caused these cuts. There was the Battle of Lewis, so if we go and find out more about the battle, find out what would have happened and see whether this fits in with the theory.
How did 180 die? Was he a victim of the battle? And why, since one of his head injuries was fatal, was he buried in the hospital cemetery, rather than with the other hundreds of victims of the battle in huge mass graves nearby. A clearer insight into the geography of the battle may help Lucy piece this puzzle together. Her next port of call was Lewes Town, where the battle took place. The Battle of Lewes was fought between King Henry III and the rebel Earl of Leicester, Simon de Montfort. De Montfort had raised an army to challenge the king, who'd been heavy-handedly wielding his power against the noblemen. All and sundry were called to fight: knights, mercenaries, as well as ordinary townsfolk. Forensic analysis of 180's stature has confirmed that he was no professional soldier, more likely a peasant who'd been called to arms. Martin Brown is an archaeologist who has studied the battle in detail. He knows what it would have been like for all rank and file.
It's all very well talking about barons and lords, but they're quite a small proportion of the people who are here and going to do the fighting. You've also got the feudal host, and these are the people who are dragged out by their landlords, lords of the manor, saying, you have to come and fight. So our figure 180, more likely, he's actually one of the people who have been almost dragged out of the fields to get involved in a quarrel about which he probably knows absolutely nothing. It's an ordinary person caught up in events way beyond his control.
Lucy has asked Martin to guide her around the battle sites, to get an idea of what it must have been like for 180 and to try and establish whose side he fought on. Was he with the king, barracked in Lewes, or one of de Montfort's rebels who were camped in the surrounding countryside? First stop is St. John the Baptist Church, which was in the grounds of the priory where the king's men had gathered the night before the battle.
The battle begins and ends here. It's the king's headquarters, and it's the place where, on the night preceding the battle, his infantry and the king and part of the court actually spent the night. Now, the cavalry sent off up to the castle, and it camps there. But the infantry, the larger force, and the king himself and a lot of the court spend the night here within the priory precincts. It had a wall around it, it had great gates, so it was secure enough for an army camp. In fact, if you read the sources, the chronicler says that they spent the night partying. They caroused, right up to the steps of the high altar of the church. So it's not just drunkenness, it's sacrilege as well. So if 180 is down here, it's a wonderful mix, I suspect, of fear, anxiety, but also probably an element of they think they're safe in the town, and a bit of a, almost a weekend away with the boys.
At dawn the following day, the king's army awoke to the news that de Montfort's army was lined up on the hillside above the town, ready for battle. If 180 wasn't with the king in the priory, he would have been here that morning, one of de Montfort's rebels, viewing a landscape that has hardly changed since that day.
The king's army are all basically still in bed down at the priory or the castle in Lewes. And first thing in the morning, some poor sentry down there sees de Montfort's army arranged across the hillside here. If 180 is down there, it's chaos. There would have been noise, bells ringing, sergeants dragging people out of bed, a lot of shouting to try and get them up onto the field to face the enemy that suddenly appeared. It must have been absolutely terrifying. I mean, the chances are this is an ordinary peasant or a person from a town, and this is probably the biggest crowd he's ever seen.
The king's son, Prince Edward, was in command of the cavalry based at Lewes Castle. He ordered an attack on one flank of de Montfort's men.
Without really waiting to see what's going on or waiting for any orders, he launches this devastating cavalry charge up the slope here, and they ride straight across and through. De Montfort's troops, they're not professional soldiers. They wouldn't have known how to defend themselves against cavalry, and they are destroyed.
A third of de Montfort's army had been wiped out.
There's a dreadful moment, which must have been appalling. If 180 is standing in de Montfort's battle lines here, seeing a third of the army just vanish, they must have wavered and morale must have absolutely collapsed. But Prince Edward's cavalry chased the stragglers and vanished from the field. De Montfort realises he's now in command of the field because he's got 2/3 of his army still in position and his cavalry, and at that point he orders an advance. And the rest of the king's army over here is basically still disorganised and still trying to get itself into position.
So what would the actual battle have been like?
Incredibly different to anything that we know today. Any killing is literally done hand to hand, face to face. It's very messy, it's very immediate. For the foot soldiers, many of them are not desperately well protected and armed. but you've also got these knights who are armoured. They've got a height advantage. You're this poor bloke on the ground who's never been in a battle before, and you've got this lunatic on a horse with a sword who's, it's, all very, very unpleasant.
The king's army, unprepared for de Montfort's rebels' action, lose their battle lines, lose heart, and chaos ensues with people fleeing in all directions. With the king's army running scared, the action moved away from the battlefield, back down this track and into Lewes town itself. 180 was buried in the hospital cemetery, just a few hundred meters away from here, and not with the majority of victims in nearby mass graves.
Where we are now is probably where it all got very messy and chaotic, as the king's army, part of it still trying to get up onto the field, and part of it being pushed back by de Montfort, sort of collided, and I suspect this was the real shambles and where a lot of the real sort of nasty hand-to-hand fighting really took place. The fact that he's down there on the hospital suggests that he was killed somewhere between here and there rather than up on the battlefield itself.
So I suppose really it would make a difference if we knew which side he might have been on as to whether or not he was running away down the hill or whether he was one of the pursuers.
Yeah, I mean, that killing blow, where does that come from?
Well, he's had several blows to the head, but I think the final one is sort of downwards from the side, and it comes across the back of the head and actually through into the jaw as well. We were trying to work out whether it came from above or just from the side, whether he was knocked down first with some of the other blows. It's difficult to tell, but it's certainly not from the front, it's certainly from behind.
So that rather suggests to me that he's heading in that direction with people following him. So does that mean he's one of the king's army? Suggests perhaps that he is, doesn't it?
So then I suppose we've got the problem of the additional burial pits which were discovered when the prison was built, is that right? Because they're actually very close to where 180 was excavated.
They are. I mean, they're a matter of yards apart, really. That suggests that he's probably knocked down immediately outside the hospital. Unless, of course, I mean, did some of his mates think maybe he's got a chance and sort of shove him into the hospital?
I suppose it's possible, but looking at the injuries now, I find it hard to believe.
Right.
You know, really think it must have been an instant death. So maybe he did just collapse outside, knocked down outside,
Yeah.
and was just taken off the street.
Yes. I guess they would have used any burial space that was available and wanted to clear up the following morning.
Yes.
Lucy's investigation suggests that 180 was killed as he fled the battlefield, and the probable location of his death, in a ferocious and deadly attack, was immediately outside the hospital where he was buried. Lewes Castle, where Prince Edward's cavalry stayed the night before the battle, is a perfect place for an overview of the battle and the death of 180.
The whole hillside we can see up there, that's the battlefield. I mean, that's where we were standing not that long ago. Essentially, we've got the view that poor sentry had on the morning of the battle. De Montfort's army stretches from that hilltop across to where the racecourse buildings are. And then the battlefield itself comes spreading down towards us now. The main action, though, is directly in front of us, but then as the King's army's broken and starts to retreat, it's actually spreading down the hill past the daycare centre, past St Anne's Church, and in fact right to the gates of the castle, and indeed down through the town as people are trying to get across the river.
So I suppose with 180, he just didn't make it down into the town.
No, he gets to that point over there, and that's where he spends the next several hundred years until he turns up on our excavations.
So after all her investigations, what does Lucy conclude happened to 180?
When I started this investigation, I wasn't at all convinced that 180 had anything to do with the battle at all. An ambush or domestic violence, a murder, seemed equally as likely. But having spoken to all the experts, the frenzied nature of the attack and the fact that such heavy instruments would have been used to cause such damage, the battle does really seem like a strong possibility. Whatever the case, it would have been a very nasty way to go, although probably he only would have felt the first few blows. As soon as the bleeding set in, death would have been very quick.